I've always thought of myself as a rational guy. I don't buy into all that ghost and monster crap. But what happened to me last month, and what's still happening now, there's no way to explain it. Hell, I don't even think I'll be alive long enough to try. It all started with an old photo. The attic was cramped and suffocating, filled with thick dust and that unmistakable musty smell of old wood. A dim light from a hanging bulb barely lit up the place, casting eerie shadows on piles of forgotten junk. Boxes spilling over with yellow papers, an old gramophone that hadn't worked in decades, and trunks sealed shut with rusted locks. The corners of the room felt unnervingly deep, like something was lurking there. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some old moth-eaten quilts in one of those dark corners, I stumbled upon a photo album. I'd been up there sorting through my late grandmother's things with my mom after her funeral. Most of it was just trash, dusty doilies, chipped porcelain, a bunch of old Reader's Digests from the 70s. And then I found that album. It was buried under some moth-eaten quilts, the leather cover cracked and peeling. I didn't think much of it at first, just flipping through the pages. Old black and white photos of people I didn't recognize. Stiff, posed smiles, the usual stuff you find in family albums. That was until I saw him. The photo was of a group of kids, maybe 5 or 6, sitting in a circle on the grass, probably at some picnic. They were all smiling, but their smiles weren't what made me stop. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the trees, was a man. His face was hidden by a mess of dark hair, but his grin, way too wide, was impossible to ignore. The corners of his mouth looked like they'd been sliced into his face, and his eyes, sharp, reflective, glinted like shards of broken glass. The way he stood, like he was crouching, ready to leap out at any second. It gave off this predator vibe, this stillness that made my skin crawl. His grin was stretched way too wide, like someone had grabbed a knife and just yanked the corners of his mouth. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, catching the flash of the camera. There was something seriously off about him, something that twisted my gut. But when I showed the photo to my mom, she just shrugged it off. Probably just some neighbor or relative, she said. Why? Does he look familiar? I shook my head. He didn't look familiar. He didn't look human. That night, I couldn't shake the image. Every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was that grotesque grin, those two bright eyes. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird photo, maybe a trick of the light or the age of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the photo that was messed up, it was him. 3 days later, I saw him in person. I was walking home from work, earbuds in, head down. It was late and the streets were almost empty. I turned a corner, and there he was, standing under a flickering streetlight. The same grin, the same eyes. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there staring me down. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just some creep trying to mess with me. I crossed the street, not daring to look back. When I finally got home, I made sure to double-check the locks on every door and window. That night I dreamed about him. In the dream, I was back in my grandmother's attic, flipping through the same photo album. Only this time, every picture had changed. In each one he was there. His grin just kept stretching wider and wider until it was the only thing I could see. After that, the sightings kept happening. I'd spot him in the subway crowd, standing completely still while everyone else rushed past. I'd catch his reflection in store windows, grinning back at me, even though I knew he wasn't there when I turned around. Once I saw him in the middle of the road while I was driving. I swerved to miss him, almost crashing into a tree. When I checked the rearview mirror, he was gone. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel him there, watching me. My mind turned into a prison, stuck on his grotesque grin, replaying it over and over. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside my window, it all felt like he was closing in. I started hearing faint laughter, barely there, and I couldn't tell if it was real or just me losing my mind. It felt like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. My friends started noticing. They saw the bags under my eyes, the way I flinched at every shadow. I tried to explain, but how the hell do you tell someone you're being haunted by a guy with an impossible grin? You're just stressed, Sarah, my best friend said. Take a break, go on a trip, you'll feel better. I wanted to believe her, so I did what she said. I booked a cabin in the mountains far from the city, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I figured if I could just get away, maybe I could leave him behind. But he followed me. The first night at the cabin was quiet. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, and jumped at every creak from the old wooden floors. By the second night, I started to think maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was all just in my head. The third night, everything felt wrong. There was this strange electric stillness in the air, the kind that makes every little sound sharper, every shadow darker. I thought I heard the wind rustling the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It was soft at first, barely noticeable. A low, guttural chuckle that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then on the third night, I heard it again. It started soft, almost like a whisper, a deep, guttural laugh coming from inside the walls. I froze, clutching the kitchen knife I'd started carrying around for protection. The laugh grew louder, more persistent, and then I realized it was coming from outside. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled back the curtains, and there he was, standing in the clearing just beyond the cabin. His grin was wider than it had ever been, his eyes glowing in the dark. He raised his hand and waved. That's when I completely snapped. I ran outside, screaming at him to leave me the hell alone. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. His features were shifting, melting. By the time I reached him, he wasn't a man anymore, he was me. For a moment, everything around me seemed to tilt. My knees went weak, and the weight of the realization nearly crushed me. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stumbled back, clutching my chest, like I could stop my heart from bursting out of my ribs. My reflection, his reflection, stared back at me, that grin mocking every ounce of terror inside me. I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning on the floor of the cabin, my head pounding. The knife was gone. The front door was wide open. I packed up, left without a second thought, without looking back. Now I'm back home, but things aren't right. Every time I look in the mirror, I see it. That grin, it's small at first, barely there, but it's growing. Every day it gets a little wider. And my eyes, they're changing too. They're brighter, almost glowing. I don't know how much time I've got left, but I had to write this down. If you find this, if you see me, stay the hell away, and whatever you do, don't smile back.